was the last time you waited for something? I'm not really thinking here about the kind of waiting like waiting to get into chapel this morning, or waiting to get in to the calf because of the lines, or even waiting for the train over on Stage and Rosecrans so that you can get to class on time. Though waiting happens there, and often that's the most patience-testing kind of waiting. But I'm not even talking about waiting for more significant things, like that admissions letter from Biola, or for the grad school that you applied for, or hearing back from the job or internship interview, or maybe even for final grades to post to make sure that you actually pass the class. Though this is important waiting, and it's often really anxiety-provoking. I'm talking here about the kind of waiting that hits deep into the joys and sorrows of our human experience. I'm talking about waiting on a family member's test results to find out if cancer markers have stayed low, or for the healing of some deep relational rifts in your family, or to finally gain a sense that you really have forgiven someone for that wrong that happened so long ago, or for the salvation of somebody that you love. This kind of waiting, and all that comes with it, the pain, the heartache, the longing, the frustration, impatience, even sometimes the despair, the desperate clinging to hope in the face of darkness. This is actually a really normal human experience in this broken world. And this is the kind of waiting that we acknowledge and practice during this 4-week season that the church calls Advent. The church that I grew up in was the kind of church that observed Advent. Did any of you grow up with a wreath like this in your churches? You might have seen one last week if you came to the All-University Christmas Chapel right at the center of the gym. I grew up observing Advent in my little Lutheran church about 15 miles away from here, and to be honest, as a kid, I loved it. It was magical for me each week to watch a new candle be lit until finally on Christmas Eve, the Christ candle in the center was lit and the whole wreath was lit up. I loved it. This season of Advent has been practiced by the church since the 4th century, and over the centuries, this season has been marked by a tension between two things. The first is this joyful celebration that Jesus is born, and because of this, we have new life. But the second half, the part that causes this tension, is an expectant longing and waiting and hoping for full restoration, for full healing in our broken world. The very fact of our faith in Jesus, the fact that we are Christ followers, I think brings with it this deeply acute sense of waiting, because our trust in the sovereign God of the universe tells us that things are not yet the way they should be. Someday things will be fully healed and fully reconciled. Someday justice will come. And so our hope makes this waiting for Jesus to come again all the more poignant. Today's story brings us to a place of seeing what happens when the hope of 2 lifetimes, which is really representative of the hope of an entire nation, which is actually representative of the hope of all of humankind, is finally come. Follow along with me in Luke 2, starting at verse 22. So as our story begins, we can actually assume that Jesus is about 10 weeks old. And we know this because in Jewish custom, new mothers were considered ritually unclean during the first 40 days of their new little baby's life. Now, I personally think this was a really good bit of God's wisdom way back in the Old Testament, because to be honest, when you're a new mother, I think you need 40 days. I think you need it to figure out how to care for this new little baby, to figure out how to nurse, to figure out what cry means what. Wait, does that mean they're hungry? Does that mean they're tired? Does that mean they need to be changed? What's going on? I think Mary needs 40 days to begin to be healed, to start to heal from the physical labor of birth. And I think the parents need that 40 days for the simple biological truth that as the caregivers care for a little baby, that little baby's brain is formed. That little baby grows and is nourished mentally and physically and emotionally. And so I think that 40 days of uncleanness is really a bit of God's wisdom. Now, in Jewish culture, when someone was considered unclean, people stay away. They stay away at the risk of also becoming unclean. Again, this is a gift from the Lord for a newborn mother. And at this 40-day mark, Mary, Joseph, and their newborn could now emerge into society. And the very first thing they do is go to the court of women at the temple in Jerusalem and make a sacrifice for purification. It's right there in verse 22, presenting their new little baby, whom they, of course, knew was incredibly special, in dedication to God, there in verse 23. Now, Mary and Joseph knew, and we all knew, that this baby was more special than most firstborn males. We know the Christmas story, that his virgin birth had been foretold to Mary and by an angel, and that Joseph, who could have actually ended their engagement with a great deal of scandal on finding out that she was pregnant, Joseph chose to follow God's call in a vision to become this little boy's father. So Mary and Joseph bring Jesus to the Jerusalem temple, far from their hometown in Nazareth, unable to travel home because the time of purification had not ended, and they had to wait until everybody was well enough to take the journey. So they go to Jerusalem to offer this sacrifice. Now, they couldn't afford the lamb that was required by law. They were poor, they were far from their family who might actually help to provide for that sacrifice. And so the law allowed that 2 turtle doves or pigeons be sacrificed instead, and that's what verse 24 there is all about. That's what they came to do. But they were interrupted by 2 people, a man and a woman who had for the entirety of their lives waited for this baby to come. For centuries, prophets had proclaimed to Israel about this coming Messiah who would save them from bondage, from oppression of nations that ruled over them, who would heal the old wound that we all experience, that wound of rebellion, of sin and brokenness. Now, they didn't know exactly what this Messiah would look like. Again, prophets had foretold this for generations. So in Daniel 7, this Messiah is described as the Son of Man coming in the clouds to receive glory and to exercise everlasting dominion. In Isaiah 53, the servant of the Lord is how this Messiah is described, one who brings salvation through suffering and sacrifice. And in Isaiah 9, the Messiah is described as the kingly son of David, bringing liberation from social injustices. They didn't know what this Messiah would look like, but when they saw the baby, they knew that it was him. Luke tells us that Simeon, the first to come up to Mary and Joseph in the temple that day, was a righteous and devout man. He was one who had watched and waited for the consolation of Israel to come. And God had actually promised Simeon that he would not die until he saw the Lord's Christ. Simeon was an old man. He had been waiting his entire life. Luke tells us that he came in the Spirit into the temple. And as soon as he saw Jesus, he knew. The Messiah didn't look like Daniel's godlike Son of Man or Isaiah's kingly Son of David. It was a baby. And Simeon knew by the power of the Spirit that this was Christ the King. Emmanuel has come to thee, O Israel, right into the very heart of the temple at Jerusalem. In these first 2 chapters of Luke, we find the first 4 Christmas songs ever written, first from Zechariah, then from Mary, then from the angels. And when he saw the child, Simeon caught Jesus into his arms, blessed God, and sang the 4th song. Sovereign Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation, that you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and glory for your people Israel. Simeon's words, his song, this is a joy-filled response of a man who had waited for a lifetime in faithful service to God. They are a joy-filled response of hope pinned on the faithfulness of a sovereign God, hope that had finally been fulfilled. Simeon had prayed that he would see the Lord's salvation before he died. And now Simeon says, you are letting your servant depart in peace. He'd lived a long and faithful life of waiting. He saw salvation embodied in Jesus. And now he could let go of this life and go to his forever home. As Luke tells Jesus' story throughout the gospel, he has this tendency to pair a story about a man with a story about a woman, and he actually does this 13 times in the gospel. He does so here as well. And it's actually kind of countercultural the way he does it. Simeon was a witness to Jesus' identity as the consolation of Israel, as revelation for Gentiles, as the glory of Israel. But for Simeon's witness to have significance for the Jewish community, Deuteronomy 19 says, one witness needs corroboration from a second witness. This is culturally important. And Luke presents that second witness in a very countercultural way, in the form of an 84-year-old woman who had been widowed for the majority of her life, and who had faithfully come to the temple to worship and pray and fast for all of these years. Luke describes her faith and her devotional life in absolutely glowing terms. And though it's countercultural to have a woman, elderly, widowed, to act as a witness, Luke gives her voice great value. Luke tells us that Anna found Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus at that very hour, within moments of Simeon's delighted discovery of the Messiah. And in verse 38, we read that she began to give thanks to God and speak of him to all who are waiting for the redemption of Israel. Now that verb speaking here has the force of habitually speaking, like she couldn't help it, like she was compelled to tell over and over again to anyone she met about this child. She's described really as the first evangelist to anyone who had ears to hear that the Messiah had come. I mentioned that Luke tends to pair stories about men and women. And he does so not just in Jesus' birth here, in identifying him as the Messiah, but also in identifying him as resurrected at the very end of his gospel. Here, Luke starts with Simeon, who sees Jesus and describes him as the fulfillment of all of Old Testament history. Then Anna sees him and cannot help but speak to anyone who would hear. When Jesus is risen, the women go to the temple and find it empty. And the angel tells them Jesus is not here, he is risen. And they cannot help but go back to the disciples and say, he's risen, he's risen. Well, that story needed corroboration. The disciples didn't quite believe it. And so Jesus appears to the two on the road to Emmaus. And Jesus unpacks, just like Simeon, the Old Testament prophecy to those two men who go back and corroborate the first witness of the women who had told the disciples, hey guys, they were right. In this passage, the overwhelming and overflowing joy we see in this passage, it's born of two lifetimes of waiting and of watching, of hope and expectation, of trust in the faithfulness of God. And it's incredible to witness. So much of our lives with God are ones of waiting. Simeon waited his whole life. Anna waited her whole life, and we know that that means at least 84 years. This season of Advent creates space for us to practice waiting. We acknowledge the truth that things aren't the way we want them to be just yet, and they're also not the way that Jesus would want them to be just yet. We wait for things that we hope for in this life, the job we've been working towards, a family, to finally get into that program or class that you desperately need to graduate, the healing of a family member, the salvation of a dear friend. And there is a deeper waiting and longing and hoping for Jesus to come soon and make all things right. But in Advent, we don't practice waiting for the sake of just waiting. We practice waiting to enlarge our capacity to trust. When I was in 4th grade, my Sunday school teacher told me, if you pray, then God will answer your prayers. And so that week, I prayed. I prayed every single day that week that my grandpa would come to church on Sunday. When my mom and my aunt were in middle school, a man came knocking at my grandma's door. And my grandma, who came from a Mormon family, thought it might be the local Mormon church leader, so she quickly put out her cigarette and hid her coffee behind her back, because those aren't accepted in the Mormon community. But it turns out that this man wasn't a Mormon priest. He was the pastor of a local church in the neighborhood that he had just started to plant. And as they talked together, she thought, might just be a good idea to take my kids to Sunday school. And so she did, but it turned out that the policy of the church was that you couldn't just drop your kids off at Sunday school. You actually had to stay the whole time. And so she stayed for church and Sunday school, and she stayed for the last 40 years, and she calls this church her home. But my grandpa, he wasn't about to step foot in any church. He provided marvelously well for his family, but he was kind of an angry and gruff and stubborn kind of a guy. And if my teacher was right, though, and if I prayed, then God would answer. And I would sit next to him in church on that Sunday. So Sunday came, and I walked in the doors, and I remember eagerly looking around to see if he was there. And he wasn't yet. So I sat down, and the service began, and I kept waiting. Maybe he was just late. I turned around to look back at the doors to see if they might open, twice, 3 times. But when the sermon finally started, I resigned myself to this truth, that I had prayed, and I had waited an entire week, and God hadn't answered. My grandpa wasn't coming. My grandma didn't give up her praying, though, and while she didn't talk about it much, it became clear to me that she talked with God about it all the time, and she saw reason to hope. So when my grandpa made a new friend who just happened to be a Christian, she was kind of excited about that. When my grandpa's brother Bill occasionally talked about his faith in God, even that time when the Jeopardy category was Old Testament stories and we knew the answers to all the questions. These things gave her hope as she waited, as she sat in expectant longing and prayed for my grandfather's salvation. This story of waiting and praying and hoping and longing, this story is in my mind an Advent story. My 4th grade self didn't have the capacity or understanding to wait on God in longing and expectation. For me, a week felt like a lifetime. My grandma, however, did. One pastor theologian notes that God trains us in this kind of waiting, longing, watching, and praying, because this is, by the power of the Holy Spirit, what enlarges our capacity to trust. We are enlarged in the waiting, writes Eugene Peterson. We, of course, don't see what that enlarging is, but the longer we wait, the larger we become, and the more joyful our expectancy. Like Simeon and like Anna, my grandma's heart was enlarged in the waiting. For over 30 years, she longed and prayed and waited. And just a few days before he died, when his brother Bill came to visit him in the hospital, my grandpa did accept Jesus. He never made it through the doors of my church, but the Lord welcomed him home anyway. During this season of Advent, we practice waiting. And in the waiting, there is room for the longing and the sorrow, and yes, even the frustration and impatience that comes with waiting for those things that matter most. This Advent story in my own life has been important to me. It's prompted a great deal of reflection on my own unanswered prayers, of wondering about the purpose of prayer, if the Lord usually responds with telling me to wait, because to be honest, so many of my prayers, waiting, that's the Lord's response to me. He doesn't have the greatest track record of quick answers in my life. This story is an important one to hold on to for me, because over the arch of years, I can look back and I can say, yeah, Lord, actually, this is a marvelous thing. You have increased my capacity to trust over these years. In the midst of the longing and the waiting, we can also sing a song of celebration. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel, God with us, shall come to thee, O Israel. For us, the waiting and expectant hope is wrapped around God's eternal plan for all of his creation that has already come through the birth of Jesus and will be completed when he comes again to make all things new. And so in the midst of our own waiting, we celebrate. Even as we acknowledge the longing that comes in our waiting, we can hold on to the promise of Jesus. After a lifetime of watching and waiting, Simeon and Anna saw salvation. After a lifetime of prayer for my grandfather, my grandma was able to see him into the throne room of God. Each Advent, we practice waiting. We wait for Jesus to come again. And we are enlarged in the waiting, growing in our capacity for the kind of trust that Simeon and Anna model for us as we pray the Advent prayer. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.